Welcome, Esoteric Doooovidims here. I'm back today with Claire Khaw from London, and we were hoping to talk about her concepts of secular Koranism, which, from my research, seems semi-similar to what I've been talking about in terms of multicultural conservatism. And yeah, I came across Claire from some of the common circles. We've been taking part of the same blog, Stream of Spheres, Luke Ford, Babylon Hebrew, different streams. We've spoken possibly on a few streams where there are a big crowd of people, and she reached out to me. So today we'll be talking about secular Koranism, and I'll give Claire a chance to introduce herself, give whatever biographical information or resume information she wants to give to anyone who might watch this.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I suppose I should explain secular Koranism first. As a nationalist philosopher, I really wish to kind of rehabilitate nationalism as an ideology. And make it no more than motherhood and apple pie. I think we're all agreed that we just want to live under governments that we can believe are promoting the long-term national interest. And I like to think that nationalism is no more than the ideology of promoting the national interest. And so my whole concept is really securing a moral system and a political system that makes sure that we have the best possible government, so people are reasonably happy with things. So that's my purpose, really. And it just so happens that I believe that a one-party theocracy is the most efficient way of getting there. And feel free to challenge it.
Okay, I mean, presumably anyone who from my side who's watching this probably is unfamiliar with you. So, did you grow up in Malaysia?
Yes, I grew up in Malaysia, and then I came to England and
So you
went
had
to school there.
to
School here.
You had the experience of being a minority. You say your background's Taoist Buddhist, so you had the experience of being a minority within Islamic country.
Yes, but where I lived, I guess the Chinese are in the majority, so I didn't really feel, that much of a minority. As for England, I suppose, I worry about them, really, the British, because I think if I were white and British and born here, I would mind about the immigration. Yeah, and I've even met Muslims who said, yeah, I do realise that London has become a non-white majority city, and frankly, as a Muslim, this Muslim woman said to me, I feel a bit embarrassed about it. So I think that there are quite a few non-white citizens who in Britain who feel a bit worried about it too, but we're also censored, and we're also told to shut up because the idea is to accuse anyone white and indigenous of being racist if they complain about immigration, and if you're non-white, they'll accuse you of being the kind of immigrant who wants to pull out the ladder once you've got on. But anyway, I'm determined not to be silenced.
I remember I was in Jerusalem in the late 90s for a few years in rabbinic school, and my roommates were from Golders Green. I had a good friend that I lost contact over the last few years. He still even reaches out occasionally. From Golders Green, and I visited there. I stayed in Golders Green for about a week, which was comparable to a Orthodox neighborhood, probably anywhere anywhere in the world. Where once I think I took the airplane to Heathrow from Israel, and I took a cab straight to Golders Green, and from there it was basically a Jewish neighborhood. There were synagogues, kosher food all over the place, and I felt extremely comfortable there. Although when I went to a few places, I met my parents who came from the U.S. then at that time, so I was in Israel and they came from the U.S. And we went to Stonehenge and a few places in London. In it's probably similar makeup in the U.S. So I've grown up in a place here where white flight basically had already happened from when I was a child. That it's largely African American. Whites would pretty certainly be the minority where I live, and in the areas. Most of my life, I've lived in areas where whites are the minority, as opposed to the knowledge of what Greater America looks like. Even though in my immediate area, and I assume in London, in England, it's probably similar also. And I don't know if you wanted to, like, your background, if you grew up in immigrant areas where Muslims were dominant, or did you mix some white areas, or there areas where Buddhists have a reasonable majority?
Well, my parents' street is pretty mixed. So,
I know Buddhism's pretty popular here in America. There's Buddhist temples. In my neighborhood, we have Sachi Goha, the Namharinga Choi. Like 2 miles from my house, they have a temple. There's different forms of Buddhist temple. It's very popular even among white people, although there's not really a Buddhist neighborhood in anywhere. That even in New York City, yeah, I lived almost 10 years. I don't remember there being a Buddhist neighborhood. There was Chinatown right next to the Hasidic part in Borough Park, and there were a few Buddhist temples among the Chinatown, although I don't think there was like a homogeneous Buddhist area among the Chinese. So I'm not sure if you have any insight on that.
well, I think that the reason why Buddhism is so popular with Westerners is because it doesn't have any rules. So, it gives you all the good stuff without, saying you can't eat pork, you can't drink alcohol, and, all those things that I imagine liberals would dislike being restricted on. So, and of course, what they find most threatening are religions like Islam and Judaism. So, I mean, that's quite understandable. So I think Buddhism is the religion of liberals who want a bit of spirituality, basically.
Yeah, I've done my study, and Buddhism's pretty popular, and they say the three main types of Buddhism that are most popular in the West relatively are the smallest forms of Buddhism in it's in the East, namely Tibetan Buddhism, which is probably the most popular in America, the Dalai Lama, and then, as I said, the Sachi Goha Nichiren Buddhism, which is basically in every major city. In was it the Triveda? I forget the third name of the most popular Buddhism in the West, but all those in the East, I think, are relatively minor sects, or even considered cults compared to the major schools of Buddhism.
Yeah.
I mean, Taoism, I think, is relatively popular in the West.
Which one?
You said you came from Tao Buddhist background.
Yeah. I mean, Taoism, as far as I'm concerned, is Chinese ancestor worship, and you'd only do that if you were Chinese anyway. So,
The form that Westerners practice in the West is different than it would take among Eastern natives.
well, Taoism, as far as I understand it, I mean, it's a very vague idea anyway. But Taoism, as I understand it, is Chinese ancestor worship, and what would look to most people to be idolatry. Lots of little household gods. So it would be a bit like Vesta. If you go back to Roman times, a god of the household, and you don't quarrel too much or too loudly, because the household god will report on you to the heavenly authorities if your domestic quarrels are too bad and big. It's that kind of idea, really.
And you I don't know if I call them Hindu ceremonies, where you'd have like arti, and you'd have like pictures either of ancestors or great people and you'd wave candles or incense and make offerings to them.
Yeah, you remember their death days. So you remember the dead, and it's usually, you invite people, obviously family members, it's the death anniversary of whoever, you have a meal. I mean, that this keeps, the family going, I guess, family connections going, because on these occasions there would be a special meal and people would be invited and they would come and, keep in touch that way.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I do a lot of interfaith. I have a lot of passion for interfaith, and I enjoy learning about different cultures. Anyone who's seen my YouTube page, I have all types, Jains, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, different sort of Hindus, obviously, all the Christian denominations, Muslims. I've spoken to a large amount of Islamic clerics. I've been doing interfaith for 20 years. I encourage people to you flip through my YouTube if they're interested. Baha'i, and I have a great enjoyment. So, and just to we're going to move into your area of expertise, secular Koranism. But how do you get from you being a Malaysian Taoist immigrant to being a Muslim? Did you convert, or was it did you move into a Islamic dominated neighborhood in London or go to their schools?
No, I'm not actually Muslim. I remain agnostic. I preceded this by saying I'm a nationalist philosopher. I suppose to indicate that I believe that religion is instrumental in solving political problems. So at the moment, I think Christianity has failed, and it needs to be replaced. And I don't think liberalism and feminism is really good for any society or any race.
So you mean more, that you would claim that Christianity failed, because obviously in the U.S. Christianity is very popular in large parts of the world. Is Christianity outlawed in Malaysia?
Oh, no. There are plenty of churches, and plenty of my relations are in fact Christian.
But in China, there is some outlawing of Christianity. Missionaries, you're very difficult for missionaries to enter into China.
I think the Catholic Church and the Chinese authorities are doing a deal. And I think the deal is which Catholic priest would go there, and be approved of by the Chinese authorities, and I believe that the Pope is prepared to do whatever the Chinese government wants in order to get bums on pews, as they say.
I mean, if you get into your opinion that Christianity has failed, obviously, and you're in England, England has an official religion, which is the church, and it's not so to say America that has a separation of church and state, even though close to 75% of Americans are Christian, and even 40-50% of Americans probably go to church regularly. England, I know the statistics are much less for the religiosity of people in terms of their belief in church attendance, but it does have an official religion.
Yes, but you can have an official religion, but you don't actually, believe in it. You've just got bums on seats with people who don't really follow anything. Anglicanism, as I see it, is just a creature of the state. They don't particularly. It doesn't particularly protect the British, who say they are Christian, from anything at all. They're feminist, they're liberal, they're okay with gay marriage, they divorce, they have sex before marriage. All these things that used to be forbidden are now allowed. So in fact, it's indistinguishable from liberalism. So it might as well not exist.
But you're talking about on a global opinion level, or you're just referring to England itself?
I think one of the reasons why there seems to be so much problems, so many problems about African Christians being murdered by Christian Muslims is because of the problem of gay marriage. I mean, I think we know that the Africans are very disapproving of homosexuality, and they are determined to punish it. And one of the reasons why they kill Christians, African Christians, is to show disapproval of. Sorry, but I don't know what the marathon is. Sorry, hold on. Why does it come on? Yeah, sorry. So you know, one of the reasons why these murders take place is because African Christians disapprove deeply of gay marriage being spread by the people who identify with Christianity, and this means the West and Western governments. In fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself gave this warning before gay marriage was actually legalized in the UK. He said it would be if we legalize gay marriage, a lot of African Christians will be murdered. And then it was legalized, nobody cared, and obviously he didn't either, and he never said another thing about it again.
Yeah, I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury comes to Detroit like every few years. I've been to the Anglican Church. I'm a systematic, logical thinker in general, so you know, you make generic statements and you have to divide it up. If you know, obviously there's a lot of sectarianism among Christians, among Muslims, among Buddhists, among Jews, even Judaism, the small people that we are. You could see by the dislike some of my fellow Jews have for me just speaking my opinions. There's a lot of sectarianism. It's very difficult to get a monolithic opinion. I went to great lengths to go through a lot of these Pew surveys to show kind of what people believe, the sectarianism divisions, what are more belief systems, and then the actual scholarship. What do the holy sages say? What do the texts say? What do the scriptures say? What are the different nations, the different how is it looked at differently in the different nations, and even the historical developments for people who've studied a lot of history that could understand the forces behind history that may have led different nations to take different approaches to the religion. So you're making pretty wide, large statements that I don't know if you want to try to systemize it or clarify.
Well, really, I think what's really helpful about having religious principles and knowing what they are, and I know Jews, do at least discuss them, is about sticking to them and sticking to them, to the point of martyrdom. But nowadays, a lot of people don't see the point of it because the culture around them is so lax, and they can't quite see the point of sticking to the rules because it seems so unnecessarily restrictive. I mean, comparing a secular Jew's attitude towards these rules to an ultra-Orthodox Jew's attitude, it is quite a contrast. But obviously the ultra-Orthodox think they're gaining something by obeying these rules, that ulama abba. Is that how you call it?
Well, maybe we could take a break in a minute after. I want to ask push you on this, but to actually what Jews you're familiar with there, and the advantage of Judaism or Islam, at least in the Orthodox sense, even though Orthodox Judaism represents a minority of Jews, is that we have a system of laws, we have historical precedents, the scriptures, the source, the Talmud, the halakha, the rabbis of each generation. Each major town has rabbinic councils that make decisions that are largely binding upon the people who affiliate with that. In Islam, largely works the same way, where you have the jurisprudence precedents of the Quran and the Hadith, and each sect, town, and area has their own leadership and councils that make decisions that are largely binding. And Christianity, in some extent, historically had that. Largely today, that's lacking in Christianity. Although even within Christian denominations, these decisions, there have been councils and church, different communities of churches that have made decisions on like abortion, gay marriage, female clergy. But there are ecclesiastic councils that actually get together and decide these things.
Indeed, and of course the Catholic Church used to be, well, it still is the most centralized and hierarchical form of religious Christian organization, and the Anglican Church kind of, followed in its footsteps, and that was fine when they enforced those rules, but now they no longer do. And I think that is really the problem when people who officially are supposed to be representing some moral standard refuse to do so.
We talk enforcement mechanism. So largely Orthodox Jews, Muslims living outside of the Middle East, or Christian countries such as, Islamic countries such as Malaysia, have no legal enforcement mechanism, and it's voluntary. So within Orthodox Jews, typically there's community pressure, or there's part of being a community. And so when you're part of the community, you live according to the community standards. But if you leave the community, there's no actual enforcement mechanism. And I'm sure if you follow the court cases in London, about education and trying to break up private education or enforce larger education standards, or I think they had a big in the papers, like a lesbian woman that was teaching in Orthodox schools, and she sued because she was fired. So the case of living in a diaspora community where you have no enforcement mechanism for your internal laws, but you could still privately function within your society of those who voluntarily want to live according to those codes.
Yes, but that's not the point of it, is it? I mean, the whole point of Judaism is that Jews live in Israel in their theocracy and practice those rules, and
But Israel is largely secular, obviously, and that in
yes,
Jerusalem you have riots. People are laying down in front of buses because the government wants to operate on Sabbath. The majority of people are secular and don't observe the Sabbath, but obviously it's Israel. Israel was created for a haven for the Jews, and what's more Jewish than the Sabbath? I'm not sure if you've seen the video of people laying down in front of buses and the mandatory military service. So even in Israel, largely Orthodoxy is voluntary. Besides the fact that the Orthodox rabbis control conversion.
Theocracy.
Yeah, it has a secular base of the government.
Yes, but I keep trying to tell Jews that, look, all the countries in the world that should be a theocracy, surely Israel should be a theocracy.
I went through the statistics on my page of the Pew survey and the data. There's a decent percentage of Israelis, that would like it to be a theocracy, and even a decent percentage that would like to turn it into a monarchy. And that's within the realm of conceivability that something like that could happen in Israel. And you're saying the Islamic revolutions that passed through the Middle East, to some extent, the Haredi revolutions might eventually take over Israel also. I'm not sure how much you follow that, or do you want to discuss a little bit your knowledge of the Orthodox community, or who you know within the London community? But maybe some of my viewers would be curious, who which rabbis you've met, or you said you met Rabbi Sachs a few times. You're familiar with Neturei Karta?
Yes. I've spoken to Rabbi Aaron Cohen of Neturei Karta, and Rabbi Basus of he's ultra orthodox, and I think Edgware or Finchley, or Golders Green. I forget which one. But
for people who aren't familiar with London layout, there's quite a few Jews. I think there's like 300,000-400,000 Jews in England.
I'm not sure about. I'm not familiar with the statistics. I haven't looked it up.
It's substantially less. I'm saying there's probably more Jews in even Chicago than all of England. But I learned in Hasidic schools. I lived in Hasidic Brooklyn many years, and most of the Hasidices have branches in London. I think Stamford Hill would be the most Orthodox area, where you have Yiddish is the common language on the street, and you have synagogues, and the Jews basically live like a shtetl, separate life within our own quarters of London. That would be Stamford Hill, and I think they made a documentary on PBS years ago, like called Stamford Hill Cowboy, about that. I remember when I was walking the streets in London, someone called me a Stamford Hill Cowboy because I had a black hat on at the time. And then there's Golders Green, which is more like upper middle class, more wealthy. So there are Orthodox Jews there. So if it's like satellite synagogues, like the poor area, Stamford Hill, that's where the bulk of the Jewish Yiddish-speaking ultra-Orthodox community lives. The wealthier community is Golders Green, which would have some Reform and secular and modern Orthodox. There's also, I think, Hemden, which has a large diverse population, but it's also a large Arab Muslim area. So you have the Jews and the Muslims right next to each other in that area. And then historically, there were secular Reform Jews that are generally on the decline all across England. And Gateshead, there's a few satellite Jewish areas that have a handful. Like Gateshead is a famous yeshiva going back many years, and Chabad Lubavitch is popular. I think there was even a Lubavitch rabbi who tried to run for parliament, and then God forbid he got caught up in some sex scandal or crazy like that. If you followed that news stories, and then there's protest, obviously, the anti-Israel, the BDS protest, and you'll see the Notori Karta and the extreme like Hasidic Jews that will join the Muslims protesting Israel, and then there's also a strong Zionist element in England of people that might have dual citizenship and go back and forth between Israel. So the demographics are probably similar, although you do have a chief rabbi, which is Orthodox. So in America, there's no complete separation of church and state. We have a free market of religion. I could step up and try to be a rabbi, open up my own synagogue, speak on behalf of Jews, and compete in the free market. But in England, that's not the case. You have an official chief rabbi, and that historically has always been an Orthodox rabbi.
So, so who is the most senior Orthodox rabbi in America? I've never quite.
Well, there isn't, because of the way the system works, where you have separation of church and state. So you have open market of competition within Judaism, and that's why you could have people complaining about me, and he's not representative of Jews, but basically anyone could do what they want. You could be a complete Christian, a complete non-Jew, and step up and self-identify as a Jew. I went on their Pew survey. There's over 1 million such people in America. Classically, it might relate to your secular Koranism, and you have your Orthodox Jews that believe the religion is true, the prophets and the tradition given down through the Talmud to the rabbis to today is basically the will of God. And then you have the conservative, and these denominations exist in England also, but they don't.
Doesn't it make it very difficult for Jews to enforce any kind of discipline on each other?
Well, so it's completely voluntary.
You've got this Hilul Hashem thing, don't you? So
it has to be delivered by the community. So if the Orthodox community disapproved of me in what I was doing, they could ostracize me, try to keep me out of their community, or not try to not do business with me or whatever. But it's a free market of ideas. And
what about this thing called Herem?
Well, it's saying that has no binding power. So generally, the excommunication, we're saying Herem, would only usually that refers to not being given honors in synagogue, or possibly not intermarrying with the offspring of. So it's voluntary among the community. So you have rabbis with an extreme amount of power. They're like the Lubavitch rabbi, the Moshe Feinstein of the previous generation, and I could go on and on listing rabbis. And actually, a lot of those rabbis have international. So I learned in a yeshiva called Bobov, and Bobov actually has a branch in also in Belgium and in London, and within their community, the people within the community would probably abide according to the rulings of the rabbinic court and of the chief rabbis, but outside of the community, the ruling would basically have no binding power.
Yeah, but I suppose
And I know Islam functions largely the same way in America and probably in London, where the councils could institute excommunications or sanctions or different things, but it has no binding power except to the people within the community who might choose to live according to the sanctions of their clerics, as opposed to the law of the land.
I understand. So basically,
and generally, orthodoxy, by definition, that's what it means. If you're Orthodox, you're going to live according to those standards above and beyond the law of the land.
Right. So, but it seems to me that Muslims kind of organize themselves in the same way that Presbyterian churches do. It's all sort of more geared to whoever goes to the church, which is why I suppose Presbyterians are more conservative, certainly in America, because you have Ann Coulter and Donald Trump, who are obviously, more have a more conservative mindset than an Episcopalian. And also, I think in the UK, the Presbyterians used to be more conservative, but I think they're kind of going, loosening up now, shall we say.
We have some extremist Catholic sects. You have Orthodox Jews, Muslims, some Hindus that and even in America, they'd largely be considered cultish because they favor their own law over the law of the land, and then they might self-segregate. And obviously, if you're Muslim and you pray 5 times a day, you go to mosque all the time, and it's basically an insular community that functions within the larger society, like in London, and Orthodox Jews would be the same way. We congregate in synagogue 3 times a day. We live in our closed communities. We might speak different languages, strictly follow our rules. Although at the same time, you might find us in the larger business world. We might be landlords or middlemen or import exporters, all the different type, even bankers, mortgage brokers, real estate brokers, the type professions you find us in. Although we have our internal insular community, which pejoratively in the West, you might even be considered cultish. And Christianity has largely lost that, where very few Christians function that way in these days, although historically.
But don't you think that's a problem? Don't you think that,
Well, I'm not here to diagnose problems. I mean, you still have large Amish, and you break off communities outside of the major cities. The difference.
But why aren't you interested in diagnosing problems?
Well, because I'd say my opinion doesn't really matter.
But it does.
I don't think it does. I think there's greater forces. And from a personal perspective, I say, like, my opinion doesn't matter. I don't even waste my time forming them. There's greater forces beyond our control.
Such as?
Well, such as God, history, karma, basically. There's forces of karma that are pushing historic karma, reaction.
But that's so passive, isn't it? I mean, I thought Jews were, they have all their prophets who were revolutionaries, and you're saying, oh, I'll just go with the flow.
Well, I mean, God forbid I didn't say go with the flow. I was saying that in terms of diagnosing problems, passing judgment on other people, saying God will be their judge, I'm not their judge. It's a waste of my time.
But I don't understand. I mean, don't Jews have a religious obligation to promote the no-hide laws amongst the Gentiles?
Ethics, morality, charity, some of these greater principles. So in terms of moralizing, telling people what to do, I highly recommend people living moral, ethical lives, being charitable, good people, being upstanding citizens, using their potential to the fullest. In that respect, but in terms of diagnosing
you're letting them kind of go the wrong way and saying, "Oh, I can't be bothered. It's not my place. I don't care."
Well, I just have no power over them. I'm saying,
but you're not even. You've just said I can't even be bothered to formulate my views in case I get into trouble, in case people hate me or whatever.
Well, I'm kind of libertarian in that sense. Like, other people make their own decisions. If they ask me, yeah, I put my
I
YouTube video
tried
out there.
asking you a few questions and you refused to answer.
Well, I mean, it's like, in my opinion on these things don't matter. It's like, okay, like, what's my opinion on abortion? It's like, what's my opinion on gay marriage? And generally,
But
it's like, I don't have opinions on these things. Like,
but why? I think you're just avoiding politics, aren't you?
yeah, I'm apolitical. I mean, generally here in the U.S.
But
also,
isn't
there's
religion and politics the same thing?
possibly. I mean, in the U.S. there used to be laws that prevented clerics from taking part in partisan politics, and generally, you want to be nonpartisan. You want your interests represented on both ends of the spectrum. That like, for example, like the pro-Israel lobby or something. You want people on the far left to the far right all being pro-Israel, or you're worrying about the state of Jews or minorities in among the greater country. So you want people from all across the political spectrum to be supportive. And when you take stances on political issues, it makes that more difficult.
Yes, I mean, I see the merit of not saying stuff to upset people if you want them to do things for you. But
well, I mean, you make it sound purely manipulative in nature, and just say also theologically, just saying that people have free will. People make their own decisions. God is their judge, not me.
And they're so lacking in guidance.
You were saying guidance in the yeah. If people wanted my guidance, it's available. Saying, okay, we got 13 people right now watching us on YouTube, but yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't want my guidance forced on other people, just like I don't want other people's guidance forced on me.
You can say as forcefully as you can, that A is A and B is B, and they'd still ignore you. But at least they know what your position is, and they might agree with you or they might kick against what you say. But at least it's clear, and they can, talk about it perhaps, and have a debate, and have a dialectic. After which they might, decide one way or the other, and by taking a position, even if it's a wrong one, as long as you're prepared to change it later, is I think helpful. But to just say it's not my business, I don't care, is kind of what a politician would do.
Yeah, I think you're miscategorizing what I'm saying when I say I don't form opinions about other people. I try not to judge other people versus saying I don't care.
But why shouldn't we cultivate our judgment? Isn't it a muscle that should be exercised? Otherwise, we would keep people lacking in judgment, and that would be a bad thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'm saying judgment, discrimination are good intellectual abilities. You should think. You should have dissected issues. You should have, understand the facts and looked at them and thought them through, as opposed to moralizing to other people or having a realistic understanding of how much you could affect other people or affect the world, or even what the best method to affect the other people of the world. Theologically, a lot of times people you'll quote it from Psalm 34, where it says, "Turn away from bad and do good," which is mentioned a few times in the Bible, the concept of
so
turn away from bad and do good. And where's your focus? Is your focus on turn away from bad, or is your focus on do good? And generally, my focus is on do good. Although, obviously a person needs to turn away from bad, but if you have the platform.
How do you do good?
Well, you do good by being nice to your fellow person, by being charitable, by living a moral, ethical life, as opposed to focusing on the sins that people commit and need to change.
Well, if there are social problems, if there are long-standing social problems, isn't it your duty to point it out? Rising crime.
If you want the pure Jewish law perspective, just like how the rabbis have understood rebuke, and I've actually spoken with Muslims on this also, is that there's a commandment to rebuke people and to correct people in their path. But generally, one thing that should be done in private, and generally, if the person's not going to listen to you, then it's not good to rebuke them. So if you think you could have an effect on the person in changing their sinful behavior by rebuking them, it's a good deed. It's a commandment to rebuke them. But if it's just going to lead to further strife, so the commandment of rebuke is not a pure one where anytime you see sin, it's a mitzvah to rebuke a person. It has to be used in intelligence. In all the laws, including Islamic law, rebuke is generally meant for private conversations, and occasionally if you're defending the glory of God, or you're defending the morals, the complete moral decay of civilization, you might have to do a public rebuke. And then you also have to consider what's the likelihood that the person you're rebuking is going to listen to you. So me and you could be on the stream right now and just put it out here and give our opinions about morals and ethics, as opposed, maybe say joining more popular culture where our opinions on morals and ethics wouldn't be popular and no one would want to listen to it. And it even likely, maybe even cause violence and extreme amounts of conflict just to voice these opinions of rebuke.
Right, but don't you think as a rabbi you have a duty to warn your congregation against sin?
Well, I don't have a
You do want to be a
congregation,
rabbi, don't you?
I studied I DM'd you. I studied in rabbinic schools, but I didn't really desire to be a pulpit rabbi or a public rabbi, just a private scholar, to know for myself how to live the moral, ethical life, how to be a good Jew. So I studied, rabbinic school and what would be called rabbinic studies, because most Jews these days don't study it. So the only people who study this stuff are people who are looking for a pulpit, looking for power in the community, as opposed to historically someone should study this stuff just to know how to live the moral, ethical life, to know what it means to be a Jew. So I have no pulpit or no position like that. And generally, even if I did, the best way is to live as an example where people say, oh, this person is living a moral, ethical life, and people would want to emulate the way that person lives, and doesn't need the rebuke factor that person is out there and chiding people for their sinful ways.
May I know what you think of Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi?
I mean, I'm familiar with him. He's pretty popular on the internet. He's got some good and bad points, and you could semi-compare him because he only speaks at events he's invited to, and he's got his YouTube channel, and so if people saw me on YouTube and started sharing it and making clips and like, oh my God, did you hear what this person said, in a negative type way, but I wasn't, so to say, forcing it down their throat. I'm not appearing on public appearances to rebuke people. So I have a respect and like for Rabbi Mizrahi. I know he's semi-controversial, but I think that's largely taken out of context because he's usually only speaks to audience he's invited to, and or puts his stuff out on the social media, and people take that from there out of context.
Yes, I think he's controversial because he does actually warn Jews about stuff they shouldn't do.
He made that point. I saw an interview of him recently, and he said, your average people who do what's called kiruv, or promoting people that they should live an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle, only focus on the good, as opposed to him, where he tells people you can't sin and get away with it. So in that sense, I'm much more similar to Rabbi Mizrahi, that I'll extol the value of not living a sinful life, as opposed to a lot of people in the Jewish outreach movement will only focus on the positive aspects, as opposed to warning people of not living a sinful life. So I mean, that, like, I'm in agreement that I constantly say you can't sin and get away with it, and a person shouldn't live a sinful life, but I'm not really in the rebuke business.
Okay, but do you think Jews have a duty to the Gentile about the no-hide laws?
Yeah, saying that generally that's preaching morals and ethics, and to be good to your fellow human being. And
no, but there are specific 7 things, like, you do not eat an animal while it's still alive, do not steal, do not commit sexual immorality, do not practice idolatry. But
I mean, it's like the question of, say, abortion, of adultery, of homosexuality, to say, okay, in a perfect world, maybe those things wouldn't exist at all, that there'd be no abortion, there'd be no homosexuality, there'd be no adultery, maybe there, it wouldn't be divorce or, eating the limb of an animal. But it's like, so the rebuke factor of one thing trying to legislate it. So it's okay, like, let's say you find abortion abominable and you're here in America. Is that going to be an issue that you want to take to the public and try to legislate? Or you just I have my private opinions on it, and it's like rebuking people when they're not going to listen, and moralizing. And it's like, adultery statistics in America are abominable. That I think over half of U.S. people commit adultery. So I mean, in the Torah, according to Mosaic Islamic law, adultery could even be punished by death. And but it seems kind of ridiculous and silly to try, if you're gonna argue for the reinstitution of the death penalty for adultery or something like that.
Well, you don't have to go quite so far. I think, according to the Quran, you just lash them 100 times, and in public, and they get the message you're not supposed to do that. And in fact, I know in America, I
think you're incorrect on that.
Adultery is still a criminal offense.
Well, I think you're incorrect on that. That the penalty for that's pretty clearly death, according to Islam and Judaism. And it hasn't been, even in Islamic countries till today, you occasionally will see the death penalty.
That comes from the Hadith, but the Quran doesn't.
It comes from Moses. It comes from Moses. Jews haven't practiced the death penalty for adultery for thousands of years. But Moses pretty clearly says the penalty for adultery is death. Mm-hmm. And I'm not arguing.
Well, I'm not. I'm not proposing that, but I'm just saying, some sort of censure should be. But then we have no fault divorce in the West, so obviously the institution of marriage is not at all respected. If you can divorce your spouse for no good reason at all, apart from the fact that you're bored and irritated by him or her.
Listen, if you increase spiritual belief in God, belief in morals and ethics, sinful behavior, I don't say necessarily on its own. People have to know what sinful behavior is. People have to desire to distance themselves from sinful behavior, but enlightening people to the desire to live a moral, ethical life, dispelling the false theory of evolution and atheism, and people realizing that karma is a fact. There is action, reaction. Everything we do is recorded in the book, and we do stand judgment for it.
But most people don't believe in that. So I guess the only thing that would move them would be actual legal criminal punishments. Because there are certain people who can't be reasoned with. They'll say, I don't believe in God. I'll keep doing what I'm doing because there's no law against it, is there? And then they will suffer the
I would disagree with that fundamental tenet that there's certain people that can't be reasoned with, and that given the optimal circumstance,
we haven't got the energy,
or at least most people will make the correct decision. And it's due to the Talmud says very clearly that when people leave their body and they stand judgment before God, and God asks them about our sins, that every single person gives the same answer, that we were all suffering under the harshness of the material conditions, and we listened to what in Hebrew they call the Yetzer Hara, the urge to evil. Mm-hmm. That every person at the end of the day is guilty of sin, and every person, when they die and stand judgment before a creator, we all give the same answer. We all tell God, I'm sorry, I listened to the bad advice of the evil inclination, and I was suffering with the harshness of life and the material conditions, and say, but given optimal circumstances, that people wouldn't sin.
Yes, it was interesting how Rabbi Mizrahi says about the rabbis who don't advise their congregation properly, and that their sins will rebound onto those rabbis who because of their desire for popularity and a wider congregation, and telling the congregation what they want to hear, they won't the rabbi who doesn't advise his congregation properly will also suffer will lose points or whatever it is, that gets you to heaven
So
or
if you're
gets you
in
to
internal religious society, I mean, specifically say Orthodox Judaism or people who believe in Jewish law, people study the Jewish law because they voluntarily want to submit and live by it. I'm sure Muslims the same way, where like I've been to my local mosques, and actually I have very good relationships with most local Muslims, although I usually more interfaith with Christians and Hindus. Although a few times a year I go to events with Muslims, I go to the local mosque, and people who are from that background, they want to know that information, they live by it, they study it constantly in order to be.
But they are they're a minority. They're a minority. But what about those terrible punishments in Deuteronomy
like in
28?
America that only 10% of American Jews are Orthodox and have what in Hebrew they call the halacha, the Jewish law, that even value that, and the vast majority of Jews, they could care less what the Jewish law specifically says. But the person who want to live by that, then they have a lifetime of study to how do you live in compliance with God's law, and that could be whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Shinto, whatever religion it is. You're saying that you do believe in the concept of God's law, and you want to prescribe your life according to God's law, and you have to learn it. You have to speak with elders and know the tradition so that you could be in accordance with God's law. And so those are the people who voluntarily have came on to God and came on to a specific tradition where they want to submit themselves to God's will in the
but it's voluntary
of the tradition. Yeah, there's a voluntary, and that's what.
Okay, but I suppose if you're legislating for the national interest, you can't let people do their thing and hurt themselves and injure society by committing crimes afterwards. You have to take preventative action, and all these laws that could prevent a lot of social problems are already in the Bible and the Quran.
Well, I prescribe to American values where generally we don't take preventative action. Usually, I believe.
But America is in trouble, isn't it?
I believe in law and order. Well, I mean, we have a lot of problems, and we're dealing with a lot of troubles. But the people who want to fundamentally change our way of life, and even like from the right wing, it was President Bush who instituted a lot of this national security type issues. So we've been hit on the right and the left of losing our freedoms. But the issue to say that we don't have a preventative system, we have a punitive system where we allow the people to make mistakes, and then the system of law and order clicks into effect after the person has already broken the law,
okay,
as opposed to a preventative system. Which
is religion, punishment is law. So there you go.
We're saying preventative or after the fact.
Well, I mean, the morality comes from religion, and the religion says, don't do this, don't do that, don't lie, don't cheat, that kind of thing. And the law gets you if you, get caught cheating, lying, and whatever it is that the law says you shouldn't do. But before that, you try to prevent people from, parking in the wrong place, speeding, having terrible car accidents, whatever, by telling them to drive carefully, for example, or not overindulge in drink and drugs and
having punitive punishments after the fact, as opposed to preventative measures.
Well, you can do both.
You can, but it's saying that generally preventative measures. I mean, both punitive and preventative measures limit freedom, but in the U.S. generally we don't have preventative measures. We're having more and more of them, but that's part of the freedom and liberty that we have here, is that we allow people to make mistakes, and only if they make a mistake that's beyond the law is there a punitive punishment after the fact.
Yes, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that religion.
You can even argue that Islam and Judaism, their legal systems are somewhat based in that sense, where people have the freedom to make mistakes, and the punishment comes in after the fact. It's not preventative. That we allow people freedom and to live their life as they choose, and only step in if they go beyond the pale and breaking the law, and then we have to have a strong system of law and order.
Yeah, so a theocracy would do both. You know, the theocracy would implant in the minds of its citizenry not to do a whole bunch of things, and then it would have the laws to punish them if they
Yeah,
do
in
those
Europe, for
things.
example, excommunication for a Jew, it could be for, as little as, I think it was 4 Sabbaths a year. If you didn't show up to synagogue 4 times a year, you could be excommunicated. And like churches are like that. If you're ultra Orthodox or Islamic, and saying you got to show up 5 times a day to a mosque to pray or something like that, and you have a preventative punishment where the person may or may not be living a sinful life or doing anything wrong, but just the fact that they're not making regular prayers, or something in Hebrew called like reshus, that's their own ability, maybe like dietary laws or how they live their life, that they're not affecting anybody. But by the time they start you not fulfilling these ritualistic law, you already start having sanctions that are kicking in to say this person is not living according to the God's law, and we need to preventively sanction him because once he stops showing up to prayer service, God forbid, the more serious sins are knocking on the door.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
presumably
so
that's how
that
a theocracy would function. And they might not even be a different.
well,
What's the difference? God forbid, you're eating pork and stealing or something like that, and saying they're both could
it's a
be
slippery slope argument, as they
equally
say. You know, once you
punishable.
do this
Or like in Israel,
little
what's the
thing.
punishment for violating Sabbath? You're saying driving your car on Sabbath, you could argue according to biblical law is even punishable by death, as opposed to something even according to biblical law, God forbid, like rape, which you didn't carry such a harsh punishment like driving on Sabbath. So you want to say, okay, you guys are they're driving on Sabbath. So the legal system today isn't set up in that way, and that it might come on to what I'm going to call multicultural conservatism. And I guess for your secular Koranism, you don't even affiliate yourself as a Muslim. You just look at the Quran as a
As a book of
vehicle,
rules.
as a book of rules, and a vehicle to rally behind and create nations and legal structures behind.
Well, yes, yes. I
Or
mean,
you
obviously
personally think that the
that's
Quran is a superior system to the Bible and Jesus Christ, even
yes.
that you would advise Western countries that they're better off under the laws of Muhammad than under the New Testament and
Well,
Gospel of Jesus
it's the
Christ.
same laws, basically, isn't it?
I mean, it's very different because the Quran is more a legal binding system that has laws for not just how to love God and love your fellow person and be a good person, but in essence it has laws for every aspect of how we live our life, from how we get up and wash our hands and bathe and eat, as
Well,
opposed to
that's in the Hadith, actually.
you were saying it's a complete system, like the Jewish law system. The
Hmm.
Islam's basically a complete system for how to live your life in every
But it's
single
less
aspect.
restrictive than Orthodox Judaism. Would you agree with that?
It depends. In some ways yes, in some ways no. I mean, you look
Well,
at
I mean, if you're Muslim, you don't get the death penalty for missing the Sabbath, for breaking the
well,
Sabbath.
that hasn't been enforced by Jews for thousands of
I,
years.
I know, but in theory,
And
that's what the Torah says, isn't it?
yeah, in theory, also like in you like shaving or something like that, like in Jerusalem and even Brooklyn, there's signs on the street. It's forbidden to shave, and you'll have like modern Orthodox versus Orthodox, and one of the clear division lines would be something like shaving, or like wigs, covering a woman, covering their hair, wearing skirts, dressing modestly, or
Mm.
if a woman agrees that she has to cover her hair after marriage, can she fulfill that by wearing a wig, or does she have to wear a headscarf, or some sort of hijab? And even stricter like that, where some rabbis, the married woman even have to shave their head and shouldn't have hair at all after being married. And so within sectarianism, Judaism, within cultures and groups, those laws might internally be enforced. So you might have modern Orthodox Jews where women don't cover their hair, and they wouldn't be accepted in more Orthodox yeshivas group, but they might wear wigs. And the women who wear wigs in more, Haredi Hasidic worlds, they might not be accepted. And the women who still, cover their head, but they don't shave their head, in the complete these laws that it's hard to agree upon these societal laws, and it's intrinsic to sectarianism.
So
And I would presume Muslims function the same way, where they're, you could talk about, Saudi Arabia and Iran versus your average Muslim in America, like that's largely secular. You don't really have like Reform Judaism and Islam, but you could comparatively make a comparison. Say where the Reform Jews look at it as positive traditions, the traditions of our ancestors, but you don't really have to follow it. If there's something in the Bible or the rabbis say that you don't like, you don't have to follow it to be a Reformed Jew. Conservative, you have to have a little bit more reason to break away from what the tradition says. But even within that, you could look at modernism or compelling reasons, and if that argues with tradition, you could usurp the tradition as opposed to the orthodoxy, which you could, in theory, we should be living according to the tradition, but obviously we're in exile, or we have to live according to the law of the land. Versus if we were actually able to implicate or to have our own societies where we could have a theocracy, and the laws of the clerics and the religious law would actually be binding with a legal enforcement, which Muslims do have, obviously, in many countries.
yeah, because Islam is unashamed about wanting a theocracy. It's saying, well, if you believe in God, if you believe that the laws of God are contained in the Quran, then obviously you want to follow the rules and you want to be a good Muslim, and so we follow them.
Well, a lot of
That
Christians
seems
also
to make more sense than this sort of halfway yes, but no, but maybe, but who knows, and oh, it's all optional anyway, and that's why the West is in the fix it's in. I mean, I was going to talk about the Deuteronomy 26, book 26, the curses for disobedience, and the curses for disobedience are pretty terrible, and presumably.
I mean, if you're a believer, obviously.
No, but I think it applies to Gentiles too. If they break the laws, then they're going to get punished. And,
a lot of Christians. I mean, your biggest example might be something like the Westboro Baptist Church, and but even common among Protestant evangelicals that will, the decline of America, and even within the alt-right circles of degeneracy, and certainly within Christians, you do want people that do want a theocracy. In America, probably even 40% of America would like some form of Christian theocracy. But James Adam in the Federalist Papers, the American system of factionalism, defeating factionalism. It's probably the same way in England, that it's very difficult to get a majority upon these issues, and there's so many other internal factions that even if you could get 40% of Americans that might agree that you should have some sort of Christian theocracy, there would be internal factions among them that would prevent them from working together, in the same way that white nationalism fails due to internal factions. And but historically, you did have that, and you did have Christian countries, and even large parts of Europe, and even in as I mentioned, in England today, still has it still is theoretically a theocracy, even though there's some protections of a parliament. You still
we have gay marriage, we have transgenderism, we have no fault divorce, we have the feminist state.
Because the Anglican Church has approved it, but you still do have an Anglican theocracy, and that's only because the Anglican Church has sanctioned these changes, not because there is no theocracy.
So, so it's only
would you agree that you live
only?
Would you agree that you live under a theocracy?
I don't, because a theocracy would be,
as a lawyer, you would say you disagree with their interpretation of Christianity, but the Anglican Church.
I think most British people would say, no, of course we don't live in a theocracy. We live in a liberal democracy.
I mean, legally, as a legal expert, is saying if you had successfully became a member of Parliament, if your party had won enough seats and you were put into Parliament, you would have had to swear an oath to the Queen and to the Anglican Church, or not?
I believe that's what I'd have to do, yeah.
So, I mean, it is a theocracy in the sense that in order to have power, you would have had to swear an allegiance to the church and to the royal
Well, that
family.
really is
And it's
stretching
just
it,
it's
because
just a question
theocracy
that
really, you actually follow the laws of God. You don't, create this, you follow this made-up system that's only meant
you're
to
saying, but you're
preserve
making
the
a
status
separate
quo.
point. You're disagreeing upon what the correct theological interpretation of the religion is, but you don't have that power. The Anglican Church has that power,
I'm
and
not. I'm certainly not saying I have the power,
you're
but
saying the
it's
reason
so
that,
obvious that the Christians don't follow their own rules.
but
But you're
legally
okay with that.
you do live under a theocracy, and it's just that the Christian councils
I
of
really think
Anglicans.
you'll find it very difficult to persuade British people that they live under a theocracy.
But I'm talking as a lawyer, as a legal expert, as someone who was part of a party and ran for uh, you know ran for office, and you could have conceivably been a member of parliament, and factually you would have had to swear allegiance to the church and to the queen in order to as opposed to the US. If you won office, you could have taken your oath upon the Quran or Moses or the Bhagavad Gita, like Tulsi Gabbard in Hawaii took her oath on the Bhagavad Gita, and Keith Ellison took
I know,
his
but these are
oath on the
just,
Quran. You would
they're
not have
just
had that.
words.
You
But
would not have
really,
had
the
that
whole
right
point
in
of
England. You would have.
theocracy is patriarchy, isn't it? That's what people are talking about. When people respect the institution of marriage, they practice family values, that kind of thing. I think we both know what it really means. That the West is six
I think
lost.
you're talking about an ideal versus actual practicality. And saying practically you do live under a theocracy. It just happens to be that the ecclesiastical councils that make the rules that you live under are very liberal, and they support gay marriage and abortion and female
No, a
clergy.
theocracy is following rules that can be found in Scripture, not stuff made up by the Anglican Church and by the British government to suit themselves. Theocracy has a very specific meaning the laws of God. And there's nothing in the
The laws
Bible
of God as given
about
down through the
swearing
councils of
allegiance to the
men.
Queen and the Anglican Church, which actually the Catholic Church doesn't even acknowledge. But as far as the Catholics are concerned, all Protestants are heretics.
Yeah, but I mean, there is a difference between the system of London that has a chief rabbi that's officially sanctioned by the state, that has the requirement to swear allegiance to the church and the queen, and that has these ecclesiastic councils making decisions on behalf of people, as opposed to the U.S., where you have a secular democracy. You have a separation of church and state. I mean, you are recognized that that is a significant difference.
The significant difference is that in the UK,
There's no
we
House of
have an
Lords.
established church, and in America, you make a point of not having an established church. But basically, the social problems that is suffered by America and Britain are the same, because we no longer live under patriarchy. Nobody cares about the rules. Nobody even cares to remind themselves of the rules, much less mention them to anyone else in case something bad happens to them, I guess. And you seem to be going along with this and saying it's not my business. I don't care.
Well, I'm saying
Let them do whatever they do.
that's a general trend of humanity, and obviously, for example, when Napoleon, waged war across Europe, and he tried to get the Jews on his side, and he said that if the Jews supported him, that when the French won, that they would become full French citizenship, and they would live under the Enlightenment and live in somewhat a godless society as equals. And there was a big dispute among the rabbis. Some said, we're tired of this persecution and not being able to get ahead economically and having these restrictive laws placed upon us. We support Napoleon, because if Napoleon wins, we're going to have equal rights and be equal citizens and not going to be held back from positions of power and so on and so on. The other people were like, if you give people the freedom, they're going to reject their religion. So before Napoleon, most Jews were traditional. Sin was very uncommon, although people lived in poverty and oppressive manners, and so the situation that it was like in Russia till 100 years ago. And so it was a dispute among scholars. What's the better lifestyle to live in? Is it better to live under oppression and the poverty usually that's associated with oppression, or to have the freedom and the sin that comes along with the freedom? Because when you give people the freedom, most people are going to choose the path of sin.
Yeah, I mean,
And so
I suppose that's
I'm saying
understandable
these are
that
basically
people will just, let their
philosophical.
hair down and let everything hang out if the culture allows them to do that. But what I kind of want
It's like Iran, like President Ahmadinejad. We can't, he said there's not a big problem with adultery, homosexuality in Iran. He might be right, but is that worth the oppressive nature of living under a theocracy to have those moral values? So I could say, yeah, I'm not setting opinions on either side. I say, yeah, I do believe in strong moral values and traditional values, but I also believe in freedom. And can you have a middle ground? So conceivably,
I think that's possible. But anyway, I'm so glad you mentioned Iran, because Iran is one of the few powerful, independent, sovereign nations that we can think of. And because they have their theocracy and their absolute desire to hang on to their traditions, and they have their one-party state, and they will only give their citizens enough freedom as they think they require, after they follow the rules that they need to follow. And this is how they kind of still have some. They're not a U.S. vassal state, and neither is China. But I don't know what China will be in a few decades' time, because it's maybe getting too rich and maybe getting too decadent and probably not having enough babies. So we don't know. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that God has obviously made those rules, and people are sort of a bit lax about following them. And don't Jews have a duty to remind the Gentile of the Noahide laws? I thought Rabbi Schneerson said something quite strong about it, the late Rabbi Schneerson.
Yeah, but I mean, generally, the best way to do that is by exemplifying morals and ethics that people want to emulate, moral, ethical behavior,
But
as opposed to
Jews
getting
do
on a
that, do you
pedestal.
think?
Well, hopefully, a lot of them do. I mean, you think
but you're being a bit vague
Rabbi
about
Sachs.
that.
Well,
Well, Rabbi Sachs has not been coming to the defense of his own community, who are, I mean, there's Rabbi Aaron Basus, and he's saying we're being targeted by Ofsted, which is the educational arm of the British state, saying you must teach Orthodox Jewish children to be tolerant of the kind of modern culture that of transgenderism and gay marriage, and you have to tell them it's all right. This is a sort of thing we must all do now. And he was asking Rabbi Sachs to really come to his defense, and there's been nothing but a shameful silence.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm saying the modern Orthodox in general have that dispute with the ultra Orthodox, and I saw that BBC special, and I see in Brooklyn, it's probably easier to be a Jew in that sense in America than in London, and relatively that's the forcing of liberalization in Western culture that's my theory behind multicultural conservatism, that people should be able to preserve their cultures and raise their kids as they see fit, and find some way to have a conservative value and meet in the public square and have a system of law and order in commerce and infrastructure that benefits everybody, while at the same time we could preserve our systems and see as we live fit, having a strong public square and infrastructure to do that.
But you can't do this without politics, and I just don't see how you can do this without engaging in politics. And
yeah, I'm saying, I mean, I mean, there's a difference between endorsing candidates and running candidates and saying, but you could have the conversation and say, okay, I'm a civil engineer, and I'm not directly involved in politics like endorsing candidates. And here in my area, I'm usually friendly with the candidates across the spectrum, from the Democrats to the Republican, and thank God, usually both sides want to be my friend. I get on Facebook, and the Democratic candidates and Republican candidates are friending me. And but as a civil engineer, I could say my part in the public space to talk about infrastructure, to talk about what's important for society. Here we got road issues and transport issues and development issues that a lot of times are bipartisan. That's part of the point of looking for bipartisan solutions. And even in terms of the main dividing issues like healthcare and education, can you find bipartisan solutions? Because the best solutions are usually bipartisan. And the fissure in society today, where almost nothing has large consensus anymore.
Yeah, I think the problem is also representative democracy, and the corrupt cartel that is, the
I've
oligarchy.
spoken about this a few points. I mean, where my opinions about going to direct democracy, and I think at this point, representational democracy could only lead to corruption, because to have one person represent millions and millions of people in the system of elections, where it's impossible for one person to be an expert on so many different issues, and they have to be lobbied on it, and then the lobbies groom and have more power over the politicians, and a lot of issues get ignored. And I've been thinking about different answers like direct democracy.
A one-party state, perhaps?
I'd like to see some more form of direct democracy with polling or more votings or referendums where people larger voting and a bigger voice for experts, more engineers in politics.
Yes. And,
but
no, I thought it was amusing that you would want more engineers be in politics when you've expressed a desire not to be in politics, and then I just remember you're an engineer yourself.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few engineers in politics. We have a few medical doctors, but almost everybody comes from law, some business, and then a tiny bit of medicine. And you'll occasionally find like architects. I mean, actually, Netanyahu's an architect. That's an anomaly where you have people like architects and engineers. In just the fact that you come on to government power in the first place, and you could be influential in the public sphere in the form of ideas or religion. And that's why if you're prominent in the Jewish community, members of both the Democrat and the Republican Party are going to seek your favor in endorsements. And that goes the same way if you're a prominent lawyer, engineer, business firm, doctor. You're going to have friends on both sides of the aisle. And it should be that way. You're saying, okay, I'm a good American. I feel comfortable among Democrats and Republicans. And I form my opinions on issues one by one, where I'd analyze each issue separately, and as opposed to having to be forced into a party platform that has opinions on a whole bunch of issues that some I agree with, some I don't. Mm-hmm. But I mean, in generally, I believe in mass enlightenment, like paradigm shifts, messianic terms. The solutions to the problems you're mentioning aren't going to be found in politics. They're going to be found in some form of mass enlightenment, some method of making people take their life more seriously, take education more seriously, be nicer to their fellow human being, care about their fellow human being more, care about the public square, realize the problems of the tragedy of the commons, and you take more interest in different cultures, learn more about other people, and so on and so on. These things are going to improve the public square, and that will be regardless of whatever religion or party or legal system, that these will create better societies no matter how people choose to organize. And I always mention the Noahide laws. I tried to explain this to Luke and many other people, and I think people really failed to get it. Content watcher, if he's watching, he seems the only one who seemed to get it. I'm not sure if he wants to join in at some point. We've been talking for over an hour, but that you need a system.
Yeah, but please have him on. I'm sure he'd like to come on.
Yeah, well, let me see if I don't have his. But I mean, the idea was that there's the 7 Noahide laws. The most important one is having a system of justice, and it has to be a fair, equitable system of justice. But that could take different forms, and theoretically, Saudi Arabia, China, you could have any system that's fair and just, and different people, it will be manifested in a different way. So some might be more harsh, some might be more lenient. As long as the rules are administered in a fair and equitable manner, the rules could be extremely different. So, one society could be harsh, where the punishment for a lot of crimes is death and public floggings and beatings. As long as it's known beforehand that these are the rules, and it's fairly administered, where some people don't get to break the rules and not be the punishment, and some societies could be more liberal, and where there's almost no punishment but it's fairly administered, and people know that these are the laws we're living under.
Yeah. So I mean, I suppose one of the reasons why I think you should base your laws on a book whose wording is undisputed, because otherwise you'll be saying, oh, I'm a liberal, and then it's like, but there's no book on liberalism whose principles all liberals are agreed on, and they keep breaking their own rules anyway. And the same thing with conservatism. They just make stuff up as they go along. And but with scripture, it's like, well, at least the words are there, and no one disputes them. So nobody can just sort of make up a new rule.
I come on personally to Freemasonry, and to some extent, my ideas of the Noahide laws and the universal brotherhood of man would be in the form of Freemasonry. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Freemasonry, if you're familiar with that from Malaysia or London or history, or if you're actually a Mason.
I know a little bit about them. Yeah.
And I'm not talking like necessarily your local lodge, but the theory of Masonry, like a speculative Masonry as opposed to maybe a more operative Masonry, in the same way that the church has become corrupted, or the synagogue has become corrupted, the lodge also has become corrupted. But you need a universal system of monotheism, of morals and ethics, and I would use some sort of Masonic system, because we're not going to come to agreement on a scripture. There's so many different people in like the sages, so you could say you would collectively, even within one tradition, like Judaism or Islam, Christianity, there's no agreement on who the accepted sages are.
And there's no need. You just use the book of rules. I mean, worshipping saints is a form of idolatry, isn't it?
Do you follow Hindu nationalism? I'm big in Hinduism. Do you know the Hare Krishnas in your area? I'm actually affiliated with the Hare Krishnas. I know they're very big in
Right. No, I guess I don't really.
They're actually growing in Malaysia. I've seen they had a few temples, but I follow Hindu nationalism. You follow that at all?
No, not really. Simply because I know it's idolatrous.
But you don't support Hindu nationalism for India? You don't think that India should function as a Hindu state? That they should be able to outlaw. I mean, I know there's a lot of Muslims in India, but they should be able to outlaw beef eating or something like that, have their form of theocracy.
Well, okay.
Or you think that India,
I'll tell you why I don't
approve. Hindus should have to prescribe to biblical values?
No. What I'm trying to say is that any religion that has a priesthood is inherently corruptible. So, well, I think it happened to the Jews too, when you had Hebrew priests, and there was this big fight between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees eventually won, because the Pharisees were like kind of Trump supporters, and the Sadducees were like the liberal elite who only cared about their privileges and putting on a good show for the people. So really, the priesthood is always corruptible, because everybody knows who they are, what they do, and how they can be found, and they're always doing secret deals with politicians behind the scenes. But for Islam, the closest you can get to a priesthood would be the judicial judiciary are the people who apply and interpret the laws. But what's great about that is that all legal decisions will be made in open court, or or that there will be a judgment and it will be at least argued over, and it can be appealed. So I mean, I'm not saying a judiciary will never be corrupted, just that it will be harder to corrupt them, and if they are corrupt, they can easily be found out by arguing over their judgment and legal decision, and appealing them if they get it wrong. So that would be a more transparent way of dealing with injustices. And I kind
I
of
made
like
these points. I tried to express them on other streams, and actually, I think because you're a lawyer, and you may be more worldly. You're understanding it better than a lot of people. You were saying you had the push in the '90s under President Bush Sr. and for the one world government, and you had like the EU. And at some point, it seemed kind of like, okay, the EU is forming, and now we're just going to bring the whole world in. And then that fell apart. You had Brexit and the rise in nationalism and the banking crisis, 2008, and across the U.S. and Europe, and the rise of Trump and Modi and India, and now all these different forms of nationalism. That there seems no push for a one world government anymore, and presumably the one world government, when it was postulated, it was very popular maybe in the 90s. Towards the end of the Cold War, would have been a more Western censored central one world government. But I think my idea of multicultural conservatism would have to be some sort of one world government where you have centers of people. Yeah, you could preserve your traditions, you could live your way of life in the area, and maybe on a nationalist level where you could have London, where you have your different sections of town, and you could allow the Muslims to basically have Sharia law in their little sections of London, and you could have Christian and Buddhist and Hindu in ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, and your different European cultures all preserved within the city. But you need some system to come together and function by, and I think it's unrealistically going to be the scripture of one religion. It's not going to be the Quran. It's not going to be the Bible. There's not going to be one idol that the world universally worships. And maybe you take your
you don't have to say everybody must worship the same God or in the same way. You just say these are the laws you have to follow. But if you want to think of God as Christ, you're free.
All humans on earth,
if you want to worship idols, go ahead, but you can't break these laws. That's all I'm saying, really. So I mean, in my secular Quranist theocracy, there will be temples and synagogues and churches and all kinds of things, and there will be no mosque of secular Quranism, because it's just a legal system that everyone lives under and follows its rules. But you can drink alcohol and eat pork and whatever. I mean, only as a Jew would you not eat pork.
Well, that's why I said
and ditto as
you have your theory of your 7 Noahide laws, where maybe you could have certain universals that were like your murder, stealing, violence. These things don't have any place in the world, and there's a certain universal system of law and order. It's like President Bush, saying like, we're going to hunt you down and track you down. If you commit murder somewhere, you're not going to go to another society and find refuge. There's going to be universal system of law and order, but certain parts will be more territorial, where maybe in India eating the cow is a crime, and maybe in the Middle East eating pork is a crime, and like you have societies that are vegetarian, and then other places that society has determined these things are allowed. Maybe in Europe they don't want circumcision, they don't want halal or kosher meat or whatever, and it has to be dealt with on a societal basis. I mean, that's where I come on to the Freemasonry, where you have to really examine what are the universal principles that you could apply to all mankind, and what are parts that are open to societal interpretation.
Hmm. Um, well, I don't know. I mean, this sounds ideal. Everybody gets what they want.
Even like tax systems, like, oh, so a certain part, like um, caring for the poor. Can you have some society where um, the poor kind of could die off and no one cares about them, and other societies that have a strong safety net? Or should the world have like your UN global zero poverty goals, and saying you could have a society, you don't have to have 90% tax and universal health care, but you can't have starving people in the street.
No, of
And
course not. I mean, it just looks bad, whatever your religion.
And I mean that's the Bible. Mitt Romney's favorite verse to quote, and I like quoting it. At the end of days, all righteous people will stand shoulder to shoulder in recognition and service of the same Almighty, and that could be in different form. And saying, okay, you could be a Taoist Buddhist, or you could be a Muslim, you could be a woman, but does that mean that me and you can't stand shoulder to shoulder in recognition and service of the same Almighty, even though your ancestors might have altars and be worshiping ancestors and waving fire and different rituals, and I'm doing my rituals, or Muslims, or any different type person, that we could all be considered righteous people that
Sure.
recognize the same Creator, and and it didn't have to be a double tier system like the Quran and Islam had, where you had like the people who followed the laws of Muhammad and the prophecy of Muhammad versus the versus people of the book or protected minority status that lived under a worse condition, that you substantially more Western bent. In India or other countries is going to have a bent towards the society there, but that any person from any background could live any place in the world, and if they're moral and just, get ahead and preserve their traditions without affecting their neighbors, and function in the public square, and be able to do commerce, and have a nice infrastructure and ability to live according to their God given talent.
Yeah, well, ideally, sure, why not? I mean, but you have to take the world as you find it.
Whereas me and you, to say relatively, we're both striving towards those exact same ideals. And we might have a different vision for, saying, okay, when we have that ideal society, maybe I'm going to choose to live with my Hasidic brethren in the Yiddish speaking part of town. But we could still have that idyllic vision of what society as a whole lives like. And you might, know what part of town you want to live in, or maybe you want to live in the mixed multicultural area that has discos and bars, and maybe even allows for maybe that will allow for sinful behavior, and there'll be a section of town that allows people to not get married and fornicate and stuff like that.
It's okay with brothels. So there would be legal brothels. Okay, so it's not as restrictive as some people assume. It actually talks about brothels.
Yeah, so, and if it's
and it does actually guarantee freedom of worship with Chapter 2, verse 256. It has been said that the First Amendment is derived from that verse. Because Thomas Jefferson had
the same way that the Bible, as the prophet said, that all righteous people, all nations will stand shoulder to shoulder and worship in service of the same Almighty. In a sense, did the Quran envision Hindus and Zoroastrians and Baha'i standing shoulder to shoulder with Muslims?
Well, I mean, there's no reason why they should be discriminated against. I mean, but
standing
shoulder to shoulder suggests there's some sort of war going on, the way you're talking.
Well, that's just I don't think it meant a war. I'm just saying in the sense that we're fully functional, living to our full potential in society as your brothers and sisters under the same God, even though we have different belief systems, worship patterns, and dietary laws, customs, and so on and so on.
I wouldn't be against that. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't, have a problem with
if it's like
people
Iran,
different from different religions, being friendly.
it's like your Islamic countries. So like Iran, you have one seat of parliament for the Jews, and I don't know if the situation like the Baha'i or the Zoroastrians are like and I don't think Saudi Arabia, if they don't, how they have
Well,
their.
obviously, different countries would interpret the Quran in a different way. And, I guess whoever gains political power will have have its interpretation, the dominant one. So it's again, a matter of politics.
Is your secular Koranism somewhat in line with my like one understanding? I mean, I know, man, we didn't even get to the clear point whether you consider yourself a Muslim or not. I mean, you said you don't, but you just think that the Quran is the best vehicle we have to create a just society.
Yes.
And personally, to me, it didn't seem accurate because there's so many different types of people around the world that
but
the Quran is certainly valuable for large portions of the world and maybe all parts of the world.
If I could just be.
That's why I said like Hinduism seems more likely to be a good base in India than the Quran.
Isn't going to ban any religion.
Hinduism or China.
But I've just said I'm not going to. It's not my intention to ban any other religion. So. I do resent, you accusing me of that.
Are you like a Thomas Jefferson then, where like with the Bible, where you're just going to pick and choose and take the good verses out of the Quran, or you're going to take the thing as a whole package?
The thing as a whole package.
But I mean, you don't appreciate Thomas Jefferson's approach, where you're just going to there's certain really good verses, and society should be based on those, and the verses that aren't so good or useful, to kind of either pretend they don't exist.
Well, you'll have to ask me like, in such and such a situation, what are you going to do? But I don't see a problem at all. I've already said that freedom of worship is in fact guaranteed by Chapter 2, verse 256. But you don't seem to believe me, so that there's not much I can do.
Yeah, I was saying that's why I'm mentioning. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Thomas Jefferson.
Well, he introduced, or he had something to do with the drafting of the First Amendment.
Yeah, he actually read the Quran too. This book is written recently on the recent scholarship on the founding fathers in Islam, and there were certain founding fathers that had intended for America to have Muslims coming here. That they had figured that they had researched it, they'd read the Quran, they knew world politics, and they had discussed. Muslims, that the likelihood that would come and settle here.
Who wrote that book? The one you just showed us?
Denise Spellberg.
Oh yeah.
You know who she is?
I remember reading something online by her.
This was a popular book in courses in local universities. I went to it was assigned for undergraduate courses in Islamic studies or generic multicultural studies in America. But I mean, Thomas Jefferson, I forget whether now the Unitarian and Universalist churches have been merged. I forget whether he was Unitarian or Universalist. And what he did was he was mostly a Freemason, but what he did was he cut up the Bible. I mean, he literally cut up a Bible and just took the verses that he thought society should be based on and kept that in his Bible, and he deleted a lot of stuff that he didn't think was useful to humanity anymore. And to a large extent, that's a lot of ways how Christians in America, secular Christians or even Catholics or Protestants that aren't huge scholars, and they kind of pick and choose from the Bible. They take the generic message and pick and choose what they want from the Bible. And probably a lot of Muslims do that also, but generally where you have theocracy, that's not so popular a thing to do, is to pick and choose from the Bible, as opposed to taking it as
there's nothing in the New Testament that you can base any law on, because it's full of vague stories. There are, there's very few rules there. So that's probably why Christians are always fighting each other and why they're more schismatic. That they are the most schismatic religion of all.
What's the difference between secular Koranism and Sharia law, in essence?
It's just another form of Sharia law. as interpreted by me. That's all.
But as by you, but I'm saying if you're saying if it was a system of government, that would mean what there'd be councils, but the councils wouldn't be clerics. The councils would be
I think
people, lawyers, and university professors, as opposed to theologically trained clerics, where university professors.
They wouldn't be. What would happen would be that'd be these law students who obviously pass their exams in the law, and then there would be an extra exam for them.
When you say law, you mean Islamic law, or you mean?
No. There is no Islamic law. The law would be the law as it is now in the States, in the UK. But the extra exam that they would have to do would be an exam on Quranic knowledge. So they'd have to read it and pass an exam and on the most important verses. And then off they go. They can interpret the law and apply the law based on that.
A Neo-Confucian Chinese administration test system, but based on the Quran?
Well, I don't know what you mean by Neo-Confucian. I'm just saying it will.
Well, what
I have in mind would be as close to it now as it is.
I don't know if they still do that in China today, but I'm saying for thousands of years of Chinese history, people's position as administrators in the Chinese government were largely based on tests of how well they understood the Confucian.
I think you're talking about the exams, the civil service exam. So if you want to improve yourself,
I presume you understand that better than me, but I understand the basics of that. I'm trying to make some sort of comparison where you want for a Quranic Islamic system similar to the Chinese civil service exams.
I don't know what the Chinese system would consist of. So and they haven't done it.
But is that a reasonable? You're not looking for Sharia law like in Iran. You're looking more a system like the civil service exams. Would it be based on the Quran?
I don't know what the civil service exams you're talking about. I don't know the content of the Chinese ones. I'm just saying. You have an exam. Why won't you let me answer the question?
I just want to interject. I thought maybe you knew more about this than I thought you did. Do you speak Chinese?
Well, I didn't come here to talk about Confucianism. I'm basically telling you what the Quranic examination, the exam on Quranic knowledge would consist of. So basically, you have to read it, and then you have to answer a few questions on it, and that's it. It's not going to be that difficult. You just have to show you've read it and you understand the principles and you know what the important verses are and you know how to apply them, and that's it.
Well, just to press you, you're talking like in the U.S. you used to have citizenship requirements and tests for voting, and a lot of people in the U.S. want to reinstitute that. And if they could,
I'm not talking about that at all.
Like the Bible.
I'm talking about exams for lawyers who would be expected to apply and interpret this law I'm talking about.
If it's for lawyers, why should it be not so difficult? I mean, if it's an exam for lawyers and people are going to be politicians and leaders of society, why shouldn't they have to have, why would they be simple questions? Why wouldn't they have to master it?
That you have to read it first, and most people don't want to read it. Because unless you're in one of the learned professions, you won't be wanting to read a book like that. Most people can't bring themselves to pick it up because they hate it so much. I know a few of them like that. but yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sort of change the judiciary or whatever, or even the laws. The laws can stay as they are. The principles to be applied would just require one extra layer of knowledge, which is just to read the Quran and show you know what they are. So really, that's it.
To me, it seems you're talking more like my Freemasonry, except I would include in that the Bhagavad Gita and Confucius and the Talmud.
That's a lot. The long books you're talking about.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's what it takes to govern in today's global society, and saying all this are important.
Gita is mostly stories anyway.
Well, I mean, Bhagavad Gita is a short book relatively compared to the Vedic text. But India.
Okay, well,
Because I also support.
you have your Bhagavad Gita, ism, but I just came here to talk about secular Koranism, and
Well, to me, it's related because that's my idea of multicultural conservative. You're talking about a new world
well,
order. You're talking
then
like
you
a
would be
President Bush
overloading the
Senior.
law student who's already got so much to learn.
Are you? I mean, you're basically you knew President Bush Senior, George Bush Senior in the '90s. If you followed, do you remember his speeches?
No, I don't know which one you might mean. I may remember some of them.
I mean, he was President Bush. President Bush Jr. was president of the U.S. from 2000 to 2008. His father lost to Clinton. He was president from. He was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and he was president from '88 to '92.
Okay, what about it?
So I mean, he used to openly in his speech talk about this new world order, and then it became very unpopular. Like after 9/11, his son, the 9/11, the Islamic terrorist attacks on the U.S. that happened in 2001 was probably directly related to this idea of a new world order. But President Bush's new world order was largely like a Western banking, Christianized understanding that there'd be one system that would run the world, and it'd be like this Western capitalist Christian-centered idea. And his son, when he spoke, there's good and evil, and you're on one side or the other. And if you're talking in a similar way of like this old school Christian capitalist new world order, except to you it's not Christian, it's the Quran, but relatively
I'm not really talking about a world order. I sense that people want to, have their own country and do things in their own way. And you seem to be talking about globalism, which I don't think is, which is precisely what people are reacting against. So I'm certainly not proposing globalism at all. I'm just saying, people just want to just shut the door and
So I mean, does secular Koranism apply to
bit.
China? Does secular Koranism apply to China or not?
They can adopt it if they want. I mean, obviously, if everyone wants to adopt it, I'd be really happy. I think, what I would say to any country thinking of adopting it would be that it would allow you to keep the good of your traditions and get rid of the ones that aren't good, and still allow you to retain your own special national identity. And that is what I believe secular Koranism offers to people, because obviously every country will have their own individual way of interpreting it. And of course, I can't control how somebody is going to interpret, the book. Obviously, I didn't even write it myself. This is just a little idea saying, if you want to go back to patriarchy and have most people married, so most children have two married parents living together in a loving relationship, or at least prepared to stay together until the children are grown up, you will have more children and more biddable children, and and a lower crime rate. So
you do believe in universal humanism?
I don't know what that means.
That there's an essential value to all human life in some sort of universal laws and minimum standards that apply to all humans, regardless of their race, ethnicity, geographic location.
I think the Quran already, gives people that.
Yeah, I mean, the Quran is a universal religion.
Yeah, it's a universal religion, and the laws, the rights it gives you are what it thinks are all the rights you need.
There might have been disagreements, even like God forbid, like slavery or something, but there were laws that there was a minimum standard of treatment to people, and that applied to all people on the whole planet. There was no exception.
Yeah, I mean, the Quran has definite rules on warfare, on how to treat prisoners of war, so and how to treat your slaves. So yeah, in that book are minimum standards of treating other human beings who may be an enemy nation. So yeah, that's already taken into account.
So are you? I'm trying to at this point to try to make the clear divisions between. Are you disagreeing with my multicultural conservatism, or does your secular Koranism support and bolster and part of my multicultural conservatism, or do you have some sort of different vision?
Well, I don't really know what you mean by multicultural conservatism. I mean, you know, as far as it would apply to Britain, you know, then all the different races and religions would be subject to those laws, and of course they would be.
You're not trying to assimilate people, or you're saying you do have some form of assimilation?
There's no need to assimilate
like you
them,
have
because
a cultural preservation where there's some sort of universal values that don't require people to assimilate their culture. Or does your secular Koranism include also an assimilation of cultures?
No, because I have not said I'm going to close down other people's places of worship. People will be allowed to worship in any way they like. There will be no established church. In fact, the Anglican Church would have to be disestablished to put everyone on an, you know, even playing field, a level playing field.
Because you do, I mean, you do agree that to some level, like I said earlier, you live in a theocracy, even though it's...
No, I do not agree that we live in a theocracy, not in the UK.
You do on a legal basis because you have an official church.
I think you're stretching it a bit, but you know...
I mean, it could be an immoral theocracy or a hypocritical theocracy that doesn't follow their own teachings, but factually there is only one authority. In order to enter power, you have to swear allegiance to that authority.
Well, it's a country that claims to be Christian and a monarch that claims to be Christian, but the laws, in fact, do not follow what you might even recognize as biblical moral values.
Yeah, but they do control power. And so you have to submit to their authority to enter power.
Okay, well, I don't recognize there's any sort of theocracy at all. And you know, and I know most liberals living in this country who don't like my views at all would disagree with you vehemently that the UK is any kind of theocracy.
I mean, to me, just legally, because you have to swear your allegiance to the church and to the Queen.
Well, I haven't.
To enter power. I'm saying you haven't.
I haven't. I don't expect to enter power anyway. I mean, the most I expect is somebody in power, you know, might think we must restore the patriarchy.
But saying if your party had won enough seats that you had been included in the list to become a member of Parliament, would you have refused to swear your allegiance to the church and to the Queen, or would you have sworn allegiance to the church and to the Queen in order to enter Parliament?
Well, I suppose I'd have to do that. I mean, I know.
Would you have done it? I was saying it didn't happen. But had that happened, and had your party, had you maintained good standing in your party, and they'd won enough votes for you to actually have entered Parliament, and it came down to it where they were vetting you, and you were about ready to enter Parliament, and the only thing that was standing between you and Parliament was the oath to the Queen and the oath to the Anglican Church, would you have made it or not?
I'm not sure if Muslims who enter Parliament, and there are quite a few Muslims MP, are they expected to swear allegiance to the Church of England? You know, it's fair enough that they swear allegiance to the Queen, and I wouldn't have any problem doing that. But I can't imagine any Muslims being required to swear allegiance to the Anglican Church.
I mean, I don't know the laws if you could have problems just for
this is really a very peripheral issue anyway.
Well, to me it is, because to me, envision, and you might not even be able to answer these questions freely, but I'm saying, why wouldn't you have a problem swearing allegiance to the Queen? You would just
well, because she's head of you know, she represents the nation, and she's a constitutional monarch.
If it's unjust, you're saying that her power is unjust.
Well, she officially doesn't have any power anyway. I'll have a look at the oath of MPs, but I remember some Labour MP saying, "Yeah, I saw, but I was crossing my fingers behind my back," or something of that nature.
But if it was like, you think that the office of the Queen should be should be abolished, and saying that, of course, you're not going to swear allegiance to the Queen. Your opinion is they shouldn't have a Queen, and it should just be abolished.
No, I'm not really Republican.
Is it a crime to even say that in England? Can you even openly call for the abolition of the monarchy in England, or is that a
well, yeah, we have such people called Republicans. So there are people, in the Labour Party especially. Okay. I'll read you the wording of the swearing in of MPs. So it would be, I, name of member, swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God. That's it. Not that hard.
But the law of succession is based upon the church. I'm saying when the Queen Queen Elizabeth passes away, and whoever becomes the next monarch, that will be conferred by the Anglican Church. I'm saying that there's not just going to automatically become the next king. It's going to be a ceremony that includes the Archbishop of Canterbury and has to be officially indoctrined by the church. The church is the body that bestows the monarchy, still in England till today, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would have no trouble
Even though
to the British monarch. I think most people will see that as fair enough.
Would most Muslims? I'm saying would
Yeah. There are plenty of Muslim MPs in Parliament who must have sworn that oath, which is quite a simple one. So no compromise of religious principle is required. I mean, unless you're atheist, so you can't say "So help me God."
Or you look at the Queen as an idol, or you just reject her authority that you don't want, or saying that she's a descendant of the people who you even say, God forbid, conquered your ancestral lands and even murdered your ancestors or enslaved them, and that now you're going to swear authority to the descendant of the person who oppressed your ancestors.
Oh no, well, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I honestly, I don't have any bad feeling towards the Queen at all. I mean, I understand that she represents the British people. In my mind, in this oath, I don't think of her as representing, the entire British nation, and obviously you have to be loyal
even though her ancestors are the ones that had oppressed your ancestors, and I don't know your exact history, but I mean the British had controlled China, and they'd done horrible things to the Chinese. And I don't know if they had any.
They've done horrible things to all sorts of people. I mean, I'm quite happy to consider myself a product of the British Empire. So I don't represent. It's just, if you're an empire, you find yourself doing these things and oppressing all sorts of people and fighting all sorts of imperial wars. But my main object is to say what might help people in Western nations who are clearly in a bit of trouble, who are bothered about something that their leaders don't seem to be able to address. And this is just a little idea, a little suggestion, a little proposal that obviously, as one woman, I have no power to enforce. So, and that's it. I think, if you want social conservatism, if you want patriarchy, to remove all the mistakes of the past 5 decades, I can't think of any other better way. But, if you think everything's fine and you want everything to carry on the way it is, then obviously carry on. It's just a suggestion which you can, dismiss.
Yeah, it's interesting, and because I had a series of videos on my YouTube of ancient Hebrew texts, and saying how do you live that righteous life in the unrighteous world, and obviously the rabbis and probably the Islamicists had all these concerns with getting knighted, swearing allegiance to the Queen. Even like shaking hands with the queens. They're famous rabbis that had to shake hands with the Queen, or go through these certain ceremonies, or even knighted, or dealing with that power system that they may not respect as legitimate. And we don't have to keep on going down that role, but it's saying if you want to be a righteous person, you're saying the world largely today is unrighteous, and the legal structures that in global governments and power structures, if they're not neutral, or maybe have a bent, hopefully they have a bent towards righteousness, but you might argue they even have a bent towards towards sin and oppression. And how do you live in that society? And if you're proposing idealistic thought experiments for what a perfect society might look like, as opposed to,
I don't think it'll be perfect.
How to go about in a political realm, to how to move towards a better direction within the power and legal structures that we currently reside under.
Okay, well, if you don't like it, don't adopt it.
Or if you have a theological, saying if you're not intrinsically a theist and feel like God is running the world, and there's a push and direction of mankind that's more powerful than man, than government, than systems, bodies of law, and that God's will be manifested regardless of what any people on earth or governments or power structures try to do about it.
Well, I think, it wasn't me who said that God helps those who help themselves.
Well, yeah, obviously.
To do is say, look, there are all these rules that Jews are supposed to believe in and practice, but they don't, and the same with Christians, and the same with Muslims, and I think all the solutions are already within our grasp. We just choose not to grasp them because maybe we're too demoralized to even think of solving the problems. We prefer to blame other people. I mean, I think a lot of anti-Semitism is based, is caused by this sort of attitude of saying, well, it's not my problem, they're not my people, and if we tell them, they're only going to get angry with us, so we won't say anything. But actually, Jews are supposed to warn the Gentile and remind the Gentile of the no-hide laws. And this is what you don't do.
Well, I'm saying, I personally make a point to do it by saying the most important of the no-hide laws is belief in a creator. So I'm obviously, of course, when it comes to the no-hide laws, are pretty basic, like do not murder, do not steal.
No idolatry. Christianity is idolatrous.
Well, I put a lot of thought into that, and I do
actually Islam that is closer to the no-hide laws.
Well, I mean, there's different interpretations of what idolatry means, and there's two different. If the second commandment, there's two different aspects: is you should not have a graven image before God, like an idol, and then there's belief in any power other than God. So there's two different aspects to the idolatry. And so you have the question: what is an actual idol? What is a graven image? And then what is a separate power? So I mean, I deal a lot with Hindus.
So can you tell me on the subject? What's the role of the Holy Spirit? Jews believe in that too, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, likely that the Shekhinah is in Hebrew, that we say God asked the Jews to build a temple for God so that God would dwell within the temple. Obviously, we believe in one God that permeated the world, that existed before the physical world came into being, and the name for God, the Jehovah, Yahweh, Yud-He, Vav-He, is a play on the verb to be, that is the conjugation of that was, that is, that will be. And but at the same time, that God asked us to build a temple for Him that He may dwell in it. And then when the temple was destroyed, that Spirit of God that dwelt in the temple in Jerusalem now permeates the whole world, or travels the whole world. So I mean, that is a Hebrew concept. It's based in the Bible. The Christian understanding of the Holy Spirit might be slightly different than that. In the question, what is the belief in a power other than God? There might be powers within the universe. Someone asked me on JF, in just the live chat, you have your name, Hashem, that I say the name for the Jehovah name, and then you have Elohim, which means the gods. And the same name Elohim that we pray to God could also refer to so to say, fake gods and idols. But we do believe that there are forces in the universe that are controlled by the one true God in like a pantheistic type way. There's only one God, and that's the God I submit to. That's the God I serve. But there's forces that I interact with that are agents and emissaries of that one force, and I interact with God through the agents and emissaries, but those agents and emissaries aren't separate from that one God, and they have no power separate from God, and the only power they have is because they're energized and part of God. But I mean, that's the concept of idol worship and believing that there's a separate power. So you could say a Hindu that might have a bunch of gods in a pantheistic understanding is actually not committing idol worship, in the same way Christian who there's different understandings of Christianity being idol worship or not, but it's saying, are you a true monotheist or not? It is if you prescribe a force that's separate from God. So there's God the Son, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're all one. In essence, the church tries to say that they're not any form of idol worship because they're all one central power. That there is no power separate from the one power.
Okay, I understood the Holy Spirit as a sort of agency of God. So if God wants a miracle performed, the Holy Spirit does it. Is that the Jewish understanding too?
Well, I'm not an expert on Christianity to say that, but I mean there are different understandings of what it means for idol worship, and even if you have statues and people bow and kiss statues, or even the Queen herself, saying that there was certain understandings that the Queen herself is an idol, and that people used to bow to the Queen, right? Even today, when you get knighted, you have to bow to the Queen, right?
Yeah, but I mean, nobody's suggesting that people worship the Queen.
But people do. I mean, strict Islamic and Judeo standards have said that the knighting ceremony is actually a form of idol worship, and that the power that so I mean, they probably have a Christian understanding that somehow the church bestows power upon the Queen, and the Queen bestows that power upon the person. But where does that?
I mean, I think for European monarchs, it's the idea of the divine right to rule. So although the monarch is not supposed to be divine, they have a divine right. That's why they're there to rule. So you mustn't overthrow them, even though you get cross with them for their misrule. I think the Chinese also don't believe that their emperors are divine, because they have this idea of the mandate of heaven, which can be withdrawn if the emperor abuses his power. It's only the Japanese emperor that is considered divine. I believe that's a situation. So to pretend that your monarch is divine is a form of idolatry, which is against the Judaic view, because the idea of Jewish leadership is meritocracy, isn't it? Because the sons of Moses did not inherit his leadership; it was passed on to someone else, and certainly Islam does not even approve of a dynasty because for some reason God didn't give him any sons. So he couldn't just, say, "You're my son. You become the next caliph." So I think the idea is of a kind of meritocracy, and you have to decide using your own rules who is the best leader, but and based on what qualities, presumably of wisdom.
Did you say you had to run soon? Were you in a hurry?
Yeah, I think I have, and I guess I'm getting a bit distracted. There's a lot of noise in the background, and it's but gosh, we've been talking for over 2 hours, haven't we? So we mustn't bore our listeners. So it's been very stimulating, and I hope some of the people enjoyed it. We've got quite a few comments now, probably quite a few of them rude, but 14 likes. So yeah, so thanks, people.
Yeah, sorry, roommate's making some noise. If that's coming
Yeah,
through.
maybe it's time to go, and you're about to have
Might-
lunch or something.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation. Like, really, I could talk about these things all day. And
Yeah.
like, I was in theologians, school and yeshivas, and I could talk about these things for months and months. They're very interesting. Yeah, I'll try to rewatch through this over later and read through the chat, because I didn't read most of the chat while we were talking. And I mean, your ideas are interesting. It was interesting to speak with you, and hopefully, maybe you got a more intellectual platform to express some of the things you've been talking on other streams that might have got sidetracked into different issues. And so I'm happy to provide that platform for you. And
Thank you
for reaching out
David.
on Twitter. And hopefully we could continue, and maybe we'll do that. We try to be more structured, or can have more informative things that people will get more direct information, or even have some sort of like guiding text or study that we could use to talk through.
Okay, that sounds a good idea. Thanks a lot, Doovid.
Okay, yeah, thanks for joining me. So have a great day, and be in touch.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Yeah, bye.